Frau Lasker-Wallfisch,
Mrs. Lasker-Wallfisch, Mrs. Lasker-Harpprecht, Mr. President, we are continuing a tradition. At the end of our youth encounter, we have always had a discussion with the participants, with the main speaker and the president of the Bundestag. And, Mr. President, let me begin by giving you the floor in order to briefly welcome our guests. Yes, and I will be brief. I already welcomed you indirectly at the German Bundestag on the floor of the House. I think it's great that you have spent a few days in Dachau, in Munich, and now here, dealing with these topics. And it's great for you to be dealing with these topics because, well, you will have to actually implement what Mrs. Lasker-Wallfisch just said in the Bundestag. So I look forward to this discussion. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Since last Saturday, the young people have been dealing with conscience and resistance. We were in Munich, where we visited the White Rose Memorial. We looked into the history of the White Rose resistance movement. Then we went to the former Dachau concentration camp, the Max Mannheimer Study Center, and we looked at what other kinds of resistance there were in Germany. We also looked into various motives, what the reasons were for resisting. As every year, we have invited young people who came here following the recommendations from various institutions dealing with anti-racism, anti-Semitism and remembrance, and who are active working with memorials. And our idea was that we would briefly begin with a discussion here on the panel, and then you will have the opportunity to ask questions. Some questions have been prepared. We stuck our heads together this morning and thought about what questions we could put to our two guests and to the President of the Bundestag. I would also like to take this opportunity to welcome friends and family of the Wallfisch family. It's good to have you here with us today as well. Very briefly, let me introduce Mrs. Lasker-Harpprecht, Mrs. Lasker-Wallfisch's sister. Mrs. Lasker-Wallfisch just described in a very moving speech what she had to live through. And now just a couple of sentences so that we all know who her older sister is. She's a writer, a journalist. She also survived Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. After the war, she became an interpreter for the British Army. She worked for the BBC and for the German WDR TV station in Cologne. She published a novel which also deals with the history of her family. And if I understood you correctly, you spent a few days in Bergen-Belsen after the liberation of the concentration camp and gave an interview to the BBC. So my first question would be the following. You were convicted for a deed, as you described, Ms. Lasker-Wallfisch, in your speech earlier on, which saved you from being deported to Auschwitz. Can you maybe tell us about how this happened, why you began forging passports? It's an unusual activity for young ladies. And, well, just as a beginning, maybe, as an introduction, because we have been dealing with resistance, and if I understood you correctly, I'm not sure you were aware of this at the time, but what you did, forging passports, was part of a chain of activities taking place within the French resistance movement. So, would you like to begin? And please switch on your microphone. So, your question is, what gave us the idea to do such a stupid thing? Well, we were actually quite cheeky girls at the time. We didn't want to put up with these things. They told us, come on, you're Jews, you're going to be gassed. And we thought, no, that's out of the question. So we defended ourselves for as long as we could, and we did the craziest things. And thus we became experts in forgery. And I must say, quite openly to you, I hope there's no police officer present, there's still something forged in my passport. Because, did you hear the speech I gave in the Bundestag? We didn't travel home after being liberated from Bergen-Belsen. All of a sudden we had this opportunity to travel to England under certain conditions. And one of the conditions was that you had to be under the age of 21, and my sister was 21, so what would we do? Well, a bit of forgery. So we went to the headquarters with 50 cigarettes, where we were all registered, and we said, please deduct 2 years. So I gave her 2 years of life. So many years were stolen, so I stole 2 years back for both of us. So the result is that my passport still has the wrong birth date. But who cares? At our age, it makes no difference whether you're 91 or 93. So sometimes you just have to defend yourself against the government doing stupid things.
Yeah.
Mrs. Lasker-Harpprecht, do you remember this situation, forging passports? Yes, of course I remember. This was amongst the most important decisions in our lives. My father, who was deported along with his wife a bit earlier, he wouldn't have been too happy to hear that his two well-raised, well-educated daughters had become criminals. And my advantage was, it's hard to imagine today, but well, today we live in a multilingual world, but at the time, in Germany, when the Nazis raged for so long, unfortunately, it was always an advantage if you looked somewhat Aryan. And, well, I had a straight nose, I had blonde hair, so of the two of us, I was the one who looked a little bit more acceptable, so to say. And at the time, my parents and also my siblings, my older sister, and my sister who is here today, well, we made my parents really angry because, well, we said to my sister, "You're not our real sister, you fell off a gypsy's caravan." And, well, I don't have to repeat myself. You all heard what was said during the ceremony. We both worked in a factory that produced toilet paper. And there were subtle differences between toilet paper for officers and toilet paper for ordinary people. And, well, that's what we did at the time. And my sister was very good at sticking the labels on the toilet paper rolls. But as Anita said earlier on as well, we thought, well, we have to get away from here somehow. We cannot say at our age, well, that's it. So we had this paper coming in to the factory, and there were French prisoners of war. Many war prisoners had been taken in Germany, and the French were amongst those who were treated better than the others. They had more liberties than we did. They were able to leave their barracks in the evenings sometimes. So during this time, we made friends, and we tried with very sophisticated measures. It would take too long to explain, and I don't want to teach you how to forge papers now. We used lots of things, including raw potatoes. Do you remember, Anita? Oh, she's fallen asleep. During our forgeries, we also used raw potatoes. And we were able to write Sütterlin script. I'm sure you have no idea what we're speaking about. Does anyone know Sütterlin? This German typeface? Are you able to read it? It's a crazy, crazy script. It's very difficult, but we were able to write it. And we had an old typewriter back home, and, well, we filled in these papers, and I'm not going to go into all the details now, but, well, we got certain forms which someone had stolen, someone who had to clean the offices after working hours, and thus we got these forms which served as models. And, well, the French war prisoners, they were treated as the crème de la crème. They were treated as humans. They were allowed to travel home, for instance, if there was a death in the family or if a baby had been born. So, and this required paperwork. So we obtained these forms and, well, tried to use them to get out. And we managed to escape. Then we got to the main station, the train station in Breslau. We used these papers in order to enter the railway station, the building, but of course everything was full of SS guards, and, well, you had to make sure not to meet anyone wearing a long leather coat. That was certainly SS. So back then in Wrocław, Breslau as it was called at the time, there were, well, friends of our parents who had been arrested, and they accompanied us to the station, but they were arrested there immediately. And Anita had already been on the train. She then got off. She had put our suitcases on the train. But then she got off again, and, well, it was not possible for us to travel to France. We were arrested. And, well, it was all dark in Germany at the time, by the way, so we were taken on foot to prison in Breslau. And I don't know how long I'm supposed to speak here. I don't want to bore you, but, well, we were taken to prison, and as my sister wrote in her book, I believe, there was a friend of ours, a Jew as well, who had managed to hide. He had worked at a chemist's, and he gave us a small vial of cyanide. So he said, if you're caught, then you can take this, you'll be dead immediately, and that's it. So when we were arrested at the station, Anita and I whispered to ourselves that, well, the time had come to take this cyanide. So we counted 1, 2, 3. We poured it into our hands and we swallowed it. And I don't know whether it was Anita or myself. One of us fell. Well, I thought it tasted sweet, not of bitter almonds, so I just kept on walking. Yes, so did I. We kept walking, and it turned out that this friend of ours thought, quite rightly, that, well, he couldn't just help these 2 girls commit suicide. So, well, he actually put sugar in these small vials. And he survived, by the way, this boy who gave us this. And I met him later on. I was a witness during the Belsen trial, and, well, I was there, went to the canteen at one point, and there he was, Konrad Latte, the man who gave us the sugar. And the first thing I said to him was, thanks for the sugar, otherwise I wouldn't be here today. And it was quite fashionable at the time, people poisoning themselves rather than falling into the hands of the Gestapo. Yes, and with very few exceptions, they were absolutely right to do so. Now, I'm not speaking about our parents in particular, but people who were deported at that time and who had reached a certain age, well, they were killed. Our father was just over 50, I believe, and our mother slightly younger. And, well, no one intended to put them to work anymore. And, well, this was also, it showed that the Nazis simply didn't understand human beings, because when the people were taken from the cattle carts and people were asked, the prisoners were asked, are you healthy? And they said, no, I have pain here, I have trouble there. Well, and they were gassed immediately. And those who looked strong and who looked able, well, they were let in. But on the whole, it was a machinery of murder. And now, I don't know how much you know about this, but
es gibt ja so einen schrecklichen deutschen Ausdruck, es ist nicht vollzugsmäßig oder sowas Ähnliches.
There's this terrible German word, nachvollziehbar, conceivable. I hate to use this word, it is simply inconceivable today for old people, and my parents weren't really old at the time, for old people to be stripped of their clothes and to be lined up before a pit and shot in the back of their heads. And there were many people who were in that situation. Is that something you can imagine? No, it's inconceivable. Yes, I'd like to take you on a trip through time here, because we've been dealing with the biographies of young people, the White Rose movement, who were roughly the same age as you at the time. Things were changing, and they made a decision. They decided to do something, and you were at the same age back then. But I wanted to begin with the President of the Bundestag. Mr. President, you said in your speech that confronting our past, the Holocaust, is something which is the very essence of what our country is today. We had this event in the Reichstag just now, and there are very few parliaments commemorating the darkest hours of their history. So let me ask you, when was the first time that you, as a young man, heard about these events? And can you say what it did to you, also concerning your political work?
That's a very interesting question. In the 1950s at school, I did my Abitur exams in 1961. I was born in 1942. My father was a political person. He was in the local parliament in Baden, the region I grew up in. And of course he was not connected with the Nazis anyway, otherwise he would not have been able to become a member of parliament. But we didn't talk about these events. And at school too, we talked about history up to Bismarck, more or less. That's more or less where things ended. Gradually, people started talking about it, but really, it was only talked about more from the 1960s onwards. Of course, we did know some things. We wrote essays about the right to resist and whether that was legal or not. So there were these debates, the debates about the assassination attempt of the 20th of July. That was something we wrote an essay about, I do remember. Today, there would be no debate about that because it's clear what you would say. And there was a clear tendency in those days as well. But we had these questions about, were you allowed to do something like this? These stupid debates, really. And in the 1960s, it developed further. But it came gradually, as I say. And I have to admit that we didn't know Jewish people. There were no Jews. They'd all gone. And then a few people did come back. Some people came back straight after the war, but there were only very few of them. So we didn't have any experiences with Jewish people. And that changed a bit during the 1960s. I think it was the Auschwitz trials, etc., which changed things, these trials. That changed things. I think you might have seen the film about it. So whilst I was at university, I did think about these things more. It was more kind of present in our thoughts. And then there was this 1968 generation in Germany. And that was something which not only existed in Germany, there was a similar movement in the USA and in Paris. In Germany, it was all connected with the war question. And before that, people had not wanted to talk about these events, and I can understand that to a certain extent now. I'm 75 years old now, and the longer I think about these things, the less I can understand it. People say there were other mass murders in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, but they were not the same. Yeah, that's what I say. You shouldn't throw all these different genocides together. I'm not saying they were better or worse, but they were definitely different. But as to how the Holocaust could happen, it's really difficult. At home in Offenburg, which is on the other side of the Rhine River from Strasbourg, there they started in schools to do projects. There was one school which had a project where they sent out pupils to look and see where Jewish families had lived in their town and to find out what had happened to those families in the meantime. But that's pretty recent. That's been increasingly common in the last few years and decades.
Ignaz Bubis haben sogar mal ein kleines Buch miteinander gemacht.
Ignaz Bubis and myself wrote a small book together, so I know him. And he said that it was not until the 1990s, more or less, that he began to talk about things. I'm not sure whether he was in Auschwitz or one of the other death camps, but he never talked about it. He never talked about it with his family. And I remember my grandparents, for example, they were in the war, and other people who were from the same generation. I can remember that they didn't talk about it much. That applies to the perpetrators and the victims. The victims, too, were not able to talk about it because it was so terrible. May I just interrupt? We're accused of not wanting to talk about it, but nobody asked us. My sister and I went to London, and when we arrived, we wanted to change the world. We said we're going to talk about what we've experienced, and there was nothing. There was silence. Nobody asked us what we had experienced, and I can't accept the fact that we didn't want to talk about it. And I don't think it was because people were not interested. It's not easy, of course, to ask a question like that. And you don't just say, oh, I've heard you were in Auschwitz. How was it there? It's really difficult to broach these topics. So I think there were lots of reasons for being silent. There was the question of guilt, people who'd been involved, and then people were just kind of embarrassed, or they didn't want to, bring up these memories as to whether we still had our tattoos. People didn't ask us. And I don't need my tattoo, of course, to remember that I was in Auschwitz. It's not like I have to see my tattoo when I'm having a bath to remember that I was in Auschwitz. But I can respect the fact that it's not so easy for people, for young people, to perhaps put direct questions. I want to continue with this journey through time. When I read your book, there was one part that I found particularly moving. You were talking about the idea of what's conceivable, what's comprehensible, and in that place in the book, it was something that really was not conceivable. You played in the women's orchestra. And you must have been about 17 years old when you were in the camp and you were asked to play a piece for a certain purse. You were asked to play Dreaming by Schumann. And it was Mr. Mengele, this terrible person, who asked you to play this piece for him. This is one of the things where it's almost impossible to comprehend. I can't really picture it in my head, I must say. So you were kind of torn away from your life as a young person. You were brought up in this family, kind of protected from the world by a pleasant family living in the town of Breslau, which is now Wrocław. And my question to you is the following. What happened? How did you feel? Can you remember this situation? And there was something else I read which I found very interesting. In 1945, in July, after the liberation, you gave a concert. And the first piece that you played was exactly this same piece, the piece that you had to play for Mengele. No, that's not completely true. But correct me if I'm wrong. No, after the liberation, we were in Belsen, and then things were happening. We didn't just sit around, but we had to stay there. And there was a Mrs. Montgomery there. Her job was to make sure that there was some music. And she asked me to go to a camp where there were Italians with her, and she'd heard that there were musicians there, so I went along with her, and we did put together a group and played some really mad things, and I did play this piece, the Dreaming piece. And there was a cellist, a very good cellist there. And of course, the cello that we had was awful, and his cello was even worse. And I lent him my cello for his solos, and then he gave me it back for my solos, and then we played a duet. etc. So those were the concerts that we gave after the liberation. But it was the same piece of music that you played for Mengele. But Mengele, that was a different thing. And in a way, I regret having written that in my book because people interpret it in a different way. That was not the reason I wrote it in my book. Mengele was certainly not an idiot. He knew that there was this piece of music written by Schumann, and he wanted me to play the piece for him. People think that this was a huge event for me, but that was what happened. People came in, somebody came in and wanted you to play something for them, and that's what you did. And the only reason I included it in the book was just to show that these people were not idiots. It was not about me and about how I felt, but people, of course, read these books and they interpret certain things into what they read. But for me, it wasn't this huge event. It wasn't a huge event to play this piece for Mengele, but he is certainly not stupid. Heydrich, you know who it was. These people were not idiots. We're talking about people who had been at universities, etc. But I think that was often the case in history. The people who really changed history were intelligent. Caesar, for example, was intelligent. But I wanted to put one question, a question to all of you. I can't ask you about your parents because you're too young, but what about your grandparents? Did your grandparents talk about these things at home? Because those might have been the people, or perhaps it would have been your great-grandparents who could have experienced this. I think it's more going to be great-grandparents for this generation.
Also bei meiner Urgroßmutter ist es so, dass sie selber
I can say that my great-grandmother is a survivor, so I think that's a bit different, but she died in 2009. I was only 8 years old, so I didn't really have an opportunity to talk to her. She had survived in exile. She was not a survivor of a concentration camp. And my great-grandfather on my father's side, unfortunately, also died before I was born. And my grandfather was not born until 1943. And I think it will be comparable for other people here. Most of us would not have known our great-grandparents. And the grandparents were not those responsible if they were only 3 years old at the end of the war. The grandparents, no. But I remember being a child. We went to a very posh private school, and there were Jewish children who went to that school. There were lots of children from the Silesian aristocracy. And if we're talking about big revolutions, if there are revolutionaries here in the room, then I can say that children from aristocratic families were excellent in the way they behaved towards us. This was a time where Jews were not allowed to sit down when they were using the trams, for example. Their behavior was exemplary. They stood up and gave us their seats. And at that time, this was really sensational. So these things happened. I was a very poor pupil, I have to say, but I learnt languages, but otherwise I was not too interested in school. And I knew the granddaughter of Adolf von Menzel, the painter. That was a close friend, and they lived near to us, and she used to come and stay overnight, often at our place, and we had a really good harmonious friendship. So that was after 1933. And then I was due to meet her one day, and we wanted to go and have an ice cream together. And I went across the street and I rang the bell. And the maid came to the door, I said, oh, I'm here to go out with Helga. And the maid said, the lady of the house has said that you may no longer enter our home. So that was what I experienced on that day. And we did meet each other secretly for a while, but then I abandoned this friendship because she would have got into trouble, of course. But one thing always intrigued me. We had grandparents too. But I think all of them just died a natural death. That's correct, is it not? Our grandmother died in 1936 of natural causes. The other one, well, when my parents were deported and the two of us were left alone, we had our grandmother, Grandmama Flora. She was very elegantly dressed. The hairdresser used to come every day and do her hair. And she was deported. She was deported to Terezin. She was over 80 years of age. Yes, she was 82, 83. I remember taking her to the collection point for deportation, and she didn't know what was happening. I gave her her medicines, I put them around her neck, and then there was a Gestapo man there, and he called out her name, Lasker. And my grandmother went over to the table, she stood up in front of him, and she said, Mrs. Lasker. And I was sure he was going to kick her, but the man actually said, oh, Mrs. Lasker. That's interesting, I think. He was a young man, and he came from some kind of decent family, but he'd ended up in the SS, where everybody said, oh, those are Jews, they're all pigs. But nevertheless, he reacted and said, Mrs. Lasker, and I was so proud of her. She went back with pride. She went past him with pride. It didn't save her life, but at least it did kind of save her honor, if you like. So resistance and strength seems to be, as I understand it, this was one of the things that helped you to survive, perhaps, the two of you. From the very beginning, you were involved in forging these passports, and then all the time until you were liberated, you had this kind of strength, these strong personalities. It seems like maybe it's a family trait. Yes, maybe. I wanted to say something about your question. I did meet my great-grandmother. I think she was born around 1920, 1919, something like that. And I think it was 2011 that she died. And I didn't really talk about that kind of issue with my family at the time, but a bit later on, I talked to my mother and to my grandmother, so to her daughter. And I asked whether my great-grandmother had ever said anything about this issue, and it was not something that was really talked about. There was a lot of silence surrounding it. I would have liked to have spoken to my great-grandmother about it, but that was not possible, unfortunately. And as I understand, this was not something that she wanted to talk about. Anybody else have similar experiences, things which have happened within your families? I'm looking at those participants who don't come from Germany, because this is an international group. I come more or less from Germany. I come from Austria, in actual fact. There is a story in my family, and this is the story which I'm interested in. I think I'm one of the older people in the group, and my mother was 42 when she had me. So that means that the house where my grandmother lived was right on the route where the Hungarian Jews had to pass by on the death marches, and my grandmother was courageous at the time. She went down into the cellar, and from the window there, she put some potatoes through the window so that the Hungarian Jews had something to eat. And the SS man saw that. He stormed into her house, and of course he asked my grandmother what she was doing and told her not to do it. And my grandmother just played stupid and just said, "I don't know what you mean, no idea what you're talking about, and just carry on your way." And that was something that my mother told me when I was about 12 years old. So that was one of the stories. So this was something that people talked about in the family.
Das ist ein wichtiger Beitrag, weil
Yes, that's an important contribution,
das schreiben Sie ja beide auch,
because as you both have written,
sozusagen Sie auch gar keine Chance gehabt hätten,
you would not have had a chance of surviving without help from other people. And this was one example, a woman giving people something to eat and, well, standing up to the SS in doing so. I have, well, a somewhat more normal, negative German background. I can still talk about these things to my grandmother. She was approximately your age during World War II. She was 18 or 19, and she herself was not directly involved in crimes, but her father was at the Ministry of Agriculture, and he was an important man there. And even today, my grandmother believes that her father was not political. And, well, he held this office, yes, but he had nothing to do with the persecution of Jews, and maybe he didn't know about it anyway. So this was, well, the standard response after the war in Germany, and it's still true for my grandmother today. She simply ignores all these negative aspects, and she considers him as her father, a great man, and she just chooses to ignore these parts of his biography. I think it's also a matter of time. My generation was the generation that asked their parents, and that's different from hearing today from your grandmother about what your great-grandfather did. No, today, for our generation, it was more direct. It was asking your father, what did you do? So far more direct, and that makes it far more difficult to discuss these matters within the family. Now, if you agree, this morning the participants here came up with a few questions they would like to put to you. So let's begin with Natalie and Paul, Working Group 1.
Sehr geehrte Frau Lasker-Wallfisch,
Mrs. Lasker-Wallfisch, Mrs. Lasker-Harpprecht,
was würden Sie vor dem Hintergrund Ihrer eigenen Familiengeschichte,
could you speak up a little, please? Thank you.
Familiengeschichte und
Considering your family history and your experience of persecution, and
der Bundesregierung als Botschafter
considering the fact that there are so many refugees here today, what would you say to the German government today? Could you please just repeat? Yes, what advice would you give to the German government today when it comes to dealing with refugees? That's a very good question, yes. You mustn't forget, I don't know whether you speak to Ms. Merkel about this, but, well, you can't compare the refugees today to the kind of refugees we were. First of all, because back then the borders were closed and today they were open. Well, I simply hope things will be okay. That's all I can say. It's a huge problem because you don't really know who these people are today, whether it's all genuine. It seems rather chaotic, and we can only hope that it all turns out well. Because, well, you simply cannot compare the two situations. It would be good if the countries, the governments that force these people to become refugees, if they managed to put things straight and to prevent these people, not to give them a reason to escape their home countries. Well, everyone seems to believe that Germany is paradise, but of course that's not true. Well, yes, Germany may be paradise compared to where the refugees come from, but the question which you also raised, I believe, the fact that there was so little resistance in Germany. And, well, one of the main reasons was that people were afraid. They were afraid to speak. But they should not have been afraid of giving honest answers to questions put to them by their children or their grandchildren. Well, when we were in Dachau, one of the experts who spoke to us raised the question, what is the difference between resistance, civil courage, and commitment? And he had a very simple but very accurate answer to this question. He said, we talk about resistance once things get dangerous, once you put yourself at risk personally. And I think this is a very good way to draw the line between resistance and civil courage. So when I put my life at risk and I still act, then this means I am resisting. This is resistance. And I think that's a good definition. Because, of course, we have to ask ourselves, what will we do today? And what does resistance mean for us today? Those are the questions we asked ourselves. And we also came to the conclusion that, well, you cannot compare the situation back then to the situation today. It is completely different. But still, it helps to try to define the categories of resistance, civil courage, and commitment. I think this was important. It was a very exciting and somewhat controversial debate as well at the time. Are there any additional questions here?
Sagen Sie bitte, ob Sie mich verstehen.
Can you hear me? Am I speaking loud enough?
Hören Sie mich?
Is it okay? Can you hear me?
Ja, aber wenn du es noch ein bisschen lauter machen kannst, wäre es nicht schlecht.
Okay, ich probiere klar zu sprechen.
Okay, I'll try to speak as clearly as I can. I would like to follow up on the question that was just asked. You said the situation today cannot be compared to the situation back then when you were refugees after the end of National Socialism. So, since you were asked what advice you would give to the German government today, let me ask you, what do you think should be done about the refugee situation today? The fact that there are so many people who have fled their home countries. What do you think can be done? Is there a solution?
Ja, also ich meine, man muss versuchen, auf der einen Seite
well, of course you have to try, on the one hand, not to get too emotional. When I watch the German news, and when I see children starving, this is something I find very hard to bear. But on the other hand, of course, we all know that the German government has bitten off more than it can chew. Angela Merkel said, we can manage this. Well, no, you can't manage it. Now, I may be becoming too political. Fortunately, I no longer live in Germany, but in Italy, the situation is even more difficult. And the Italians, ordinary people at least, tend to be far more emotional. And, well, in England, people say, let's have a cup of tea first, and then we'll continue talking. So there are people arriving in Sicily, they're black, and they speak no other language, and have lots of children. And I don't know, if I was in that situation, if you asked me what to do with these people, well, if I were omnipotent, I would say, well, educate them and send them home, because they're unhappy in Europe as well. I think there is no real solution to this problem. Germany needs skilled workers, and if you have very talented young people, but you have to explain to them, maybe not what a spanner is, but what they have to do so they don't blow up the factory. Well, how do you do this?
Ja, ich glaube, das ist ein Thema, wo wir sicher in unserer Gesellschaft noch intensiv diskutieren werden.
Well, this is something we will definitely be discussing in Germany, the difference between asylum seekers and those who leave their homes for economic reasons and those who flee war. It's a big difference, of course, but this is far more than we can discuss here today. So I'd like to move on to a different topic and ask Valentin Wutschke to ask his question.
Ja, das geht ein bisschen darauf ein, worauf Frau
Well, this is about what Mrs. Lasker-Wallfisch and Mr. Schäuble spoke about in their speeches. With what degree of concern do you see anti-Semitism in Germany and in Europe today, particularly with a view to the debates in recent weeks and months? And Mrs. Lasker-Wallfisch and Mrs. Lasker-Harpprecht, what do you feel if you hear that Jewish people in Germany, in Berlin, have to hide their kippah, for instance, if they have to hide their Jewish identity? And Mr. President, what do you think has to be done here? I'll just repeat this. It's about the situation of Jews in Berlin today having to conceal their Jewish identity, not being able to openly display their kippah. And what are your feelings when you see these developments? Well, I spoke about this earlier on. It's a scandal. And what I think would be extremely important, although there's always too little time, but you should learn more Jewish history. You would be surprised if you went back 2,000 years, or maybe far less than that. Moses Mendelssohn, you may have heard of him. You should read the book about Jews in Germany. It's unbelievable, and it surprises me too. The things that were done to Jews. What Jews are being accused of is actually the same as what was being inflicted upon Jews. Jews were taxed twice, for instance, and many other things. So there is such a lack of knowledge about Jewish history. And maybe that would help, just to know more about what a strange collection of people we are, the Jews. Why are we all so rich? Well, that's absolute nonsense. I wish it were true, but we're not. And why have Jews made such important cultural contributions? That's something you mustn't forget. Maybe you're not aware of the fact, but Jews were banned from the professions of, well, dealing with money or running taverns. You've heard about all of this, you're intelligent people, but when I speak in schools, young people often don't know about this. And if you don't understand this, well, then you won't understand anything. That does not mean you all have to become friends of the Jews, but just leave them alone. And the fact that there are people with Israeli citizenship and they are forced to conceal this because they fear they may suffer violence. Well, this is incredible. This is a disgrace. Any further questions or remarks on this point? Well, I'm not as interesting as the two ladies here, but just one remark. What we can do on the government's behalf is educate, 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 and of course protect, protect, protect as well. But of course that doesn't help. It's a disgrace that we have to protect schools and kindergartens. Yes, what's the idea behind this? These children, is it their fault that the poor Palestinians, well, it's basic anti-Semitism, and you always have to find a reason. And then all of a sudden, everyone is busy thinking about the Palestinians. I feel sorry for them too. Everyone who is evicted from their home, I know how it feels. It's not nice, but history isn't always nice. And, well, what would the solution have been with these displaced persons? We were sitting around, we didn't know where to go. And the logical thing to do was, well, give the Jews a bit of land, they'll feel safe. And today many of them are coming to Berlin, and apparently they feel safer here. It's a scandal. And, well, we should fight the lack of knowledge about what Jews are. They're not that dangerous, actually. Yes, we have to fight this lack of knowledge. And we shouldn't only speak about Jews here. I think this goes a lot further. I remember in the past, when the debates about xenophobia started in Germany 20 or 30 years ago, and it was the spokespersons from the Jewish community in Germany who said, be careful. If you start marginalizing people because they're different, then who knows where this will end? And of course, today there are lots of different factors involved. People coming from Islamic countries living here as refugees, yes, they are victims of the propaganda they heard back home. And obviously, this is a problem then. And they're also victims of their religion, or rather, abuse of their religion. With all due respect, I believe that this use of religion is in fact an abuse of religion. And we as Christians have to admit that in the Islamic world, for centuries, the Jews were not treated as badly as in the Christian world. So as Christians, we shouldn't be too proud of our history either. Islam was quite tolerant for some time. But of course, today things are different and it gets mixed up with the Palestinian issue. And, well, I already mentioned Ignaz Bubis, I could mention Mr. Galinsky or Frau Knobloch, the entire list of chairpersons of the Council of Jews in Germany, and they all say that you have to be careful from the very beginning. There weren't many Jews in Germany. Today there are more. And let me tell you this story. I was Minister of the Interior from 1989 to 1991. And during that time, the borders were open toward the east. And one day, the representatives from the Central Council of Jews in Germany came to me and said, "Minister, you want us, you want to let a few thousand Jews from Russia into Germany." And how many, I said, and they said, "Oh, let 10,000 in." And I said, "Yes, okay, no problem, we'll do that." 2 days later, the Israeli ambassador came to see me, and he said, "You can't do that. Jews do not need asylum in Germany. They have their home country, Israel." And I said, "Ambassador, with all due respect, you will not expect a German interior minister to say to Jews who want to come to Germany that they cannot come to Germany. If they want to go to Israel, of course that is their right. But if they want to come to Germany, we will be extremely happy to see Jewish life re-emerge in Germany." And today, yes, we have many Jews living in Germany who come from the former Soviet Union. And yes, there may be problems within the Jewish community, that's a different story, but at least we have Jews in Germany again, and we also train rabbis in Germany. So let me tell you that the fact that this exists at all in Germany, Jewish life, for me, if I look at our history, it's a miracle. And the same is true for music. I mentioned Coco Schumann, the jazz musician, the guitar player. We had him play at the Ministry of Finance a few years ago. And we put him together with Daniel Hope, who played the violin, and Till Brönner played the trumpet. And Till Brönner, who is, well, the age of my children, the age of your parents. That's why you have to ask your great-grandparents, by the way, and mostly they won't be alive anymore. But anyway, we brought Coco Schumann and Till Brönner together, and they gave a few concerts afterwards as well. And, well, he was playing his guitar, playing La Paloma and other things. And in Germany, well, this is something which only emerged in the past few decades. Let me move on to a different working group, a different question, which also refers to the present, Lea Krawel. Where is she? And please speak as loud as possible.
Hat sie kein Mikrofon?
Doch.
Jetzt. Ah, jetzt, okay.
So,
Hören Sie mich?
Wenn das Licht leuchtet.
Okay, can you hear me?
Ja, ich bin Lea Krawel. Ich wollte erstmal nochmal
My
sagen,
name is Lea Krawel. First of all, I would like to say that it's great to have you all here today. I think I can speak on behalf of all of us if I say that this is very special for us, so thank you very much. I have a question to the three of you.
Wie sollte sich Widerstand heute gegen neuen Rechtspopulismus in Europa formieren?
How should resistance form in Europe today in the face of right-wing populism? And Mrs. Lasker-Wallfisch and Lasker-Harpprecht, you as witnesses, what do you think your job is in this context? So what can we do against far-right populism? And what is the thing that you should do personally? But they answered this question already. The two ladies cannot do much more than what they did today. Talk, talk, talk. Because, well, sometimes
deutschen
You
Bundestag zu sprechen.
don't even dare to ask, would you be willing to speak in the German Bundestag?
Die Rechtspopulisten und jetzt
Well, if you talk about right-wing
man da, glaube ich, auch ruhig
populists,
laut sagen, dass
and, well, I think I can say this here,
letzten deutschen Wahlen wir
the
nun auch
very
ein
difficult
Verein haben.
elections we had in Germany, and we have this group, what's their name? I've forgotten.
Alle aufgestanden.
They all stood up today at the end of your speech,
Ich hab die nicht, ich wusste nicht,
and that's what I wanted to ask you. I didn't know where they were sitting.
Erziehungsprozess.
Well, you see, we're educating them.
Die nicht verharmlosen. Aber
No,
immerhin,
I don't want to play things down,
bei
but
uns natürlich Besorgnisse, wie wird es sein? Ich habe glaube ich, überhaupt nicht.
there were concerns in the Bundestag about what it would be like,
Von uns aus gesehen,
and they were sitting
Abgeordneten am
to the left from our perspective. There was the government bench opposite, and next to them the AfD.
geklatscht an den
And
entscheidenden
they
Stellen.
applauded at
Und sie
the
sind am Schluss, als alle aufgestanden sind, mit Ausnahme von mir,
at the key
das hat aber andere Gründe,
during the key parts of your speech,
aber
and
da sind
then
sie auch gleich
they
aufgestanden.
stood up immediately at the end of your speech. Well, thank God I didn't know where they were sitting. I had no
Die
idea.
wollten auch da, Sie haben auch bei meiner
And
Passage, da habe ich schon drauf geachtet, als ich über
I was,
Antisemitismus gesprochen habe, haben Sie gleich schnell geklatscht. Da haben
I
die
was paying
vorne
attention there when I spoke about
das
anti-Semitism.
Kommando für die
They
Juden
also
gegeben, da haben sie
applauded.
alle ganz ehrlich geklatscht. Das
And of course, those sitting at the front told those at the back what to do, and maybe they weren't sincere in applauding, but they were applauding.
Sie merken, Sie müssen sich,
And well, I think it is better if they,
aber was wir tun können, ist,
well, whatever.
nicht davon
What we
zurückzutreten.
can do is not to shy away from these things, but to repeat time and again,
aber die im
including the
Augenblick, wenn
things
ich
they
das
don't
richtig
want to hear.
verstanden habe, und ich will es jetzt auch
But
ganz kurz sagen, also wenn
If
ich
I
die
understood you
Nachrichten
correctly,
gesehen habe,
and I'll be very brief here, but
sehe ich doch im Augenblick, dass die alle
when
beleidigt
I
sind, weil man sie nicht
watch
lieb
the
genug
news,
behandelt.
well, they seem to be offended because they're not being treated as well as they would like.
Das ist Masche.
Well, okay, that's
Haben Sie aber
their
heute
strategy.
als Ausschussvorsitzenden im Bundestag
But
gewählt.
we even
Weil wir gesagt haben, so ist die Demokratie,
voted them into positions of parliament of committee chairpersons today. And do you know Wolf Biermann? You may be too young.
Er war auch schon bei Ihnen.
Wolf Biermann, you've met him?
Bundestag hat er auch schon geredet.
He also spoke in the
toller
Bundestag, yes. He's a great singer.
Eltern, Mutter Kommunist,
His mother,
Hamburg in die
a
DDR
communist,
gegangen, dort Liedermann, dann
went to the
hat die
GDR
DDR
from
trotzdem
Hamburg,
nicht gefallen und so fand er den Realen auch
and
nicht gut und dann ist er irgendwann ausgebürgert worden nach seinem berühmten Konzert.
at some point he was thrown out of the GDR after a famous concert he gave.
Der
And
ist Ehrenbürger von Berlin.
he
Dagegen
has
hat die
an
Linkspartei
honorary
zunächst einmal
citizenship
protestiert, weil er zu den
in Berlin.
Kommunisten auch nicht sehr freundlich
And the left party protested
auch
against this
Ehrenbürger
because
von
he's not very friendly to
aus anderen
the
Gründen.
communists either. I'm also an honorary citizen of Berlin for different reasons. Many people say that I played a
Wenn man
role
alt genug wird,
in the
muss
decision
der
of
regierende
moving the
Bürgermeister,
Bundestag to
der
Berlin.
Bundesratspräsident,
And
zufällig zur Zeit.
when you're old enough, the governing mayor, the president of the Bundesrat right
Letztes Jahr
now,
wurde Biermann 80.
invites you for dinner. And last year, Biermann turned 80, so there was a dinner in the honor of Biermann. And the protocol of the governing mayor said, of course, you have to invite all parliamentary groups in the Berlin parliament, including AfD. And he told Biermann, and Biermann said, then I'm not going to go because it's a dinner I'm supposed to come here to eat, and I would have to vomit.
Als ich Ehrenbürger wurde mit den Kommunisten, ja. Nicht wahr? Aber so ist Demokratie.
Well, that's what
Sie sind
democracy
gewählt,
is
haben
like.
Zeit
It
weg,
was
aber Sie müssen sich an die
similar
Regeln
for me with the
wir sagen
communists.
denen,
But,
wenn ihr
well,
euch an die
they
Regeln
are
haltet,
elected
lieben
and they
wir
have
es
to
nicht,
stick
das
to the
ist
rules. And if they stick to the
hab's
rules,
ja
okay, we don't have to love you.
Das war ein Wahlgeheimnis.
I didn't vote for them
Aber
either.
wenn
But
Sie sich an die Regeln
if
halten,
they
haben
stick
Sie
to the
dieselben
rules,
Rechte.
they have the same rights
Und wenn
as
Sie sich
everybody
jetzt
else.
bemühen, wie heute, sich
And
anständig zu benehmen,
if they make an effort to behave like they
wenn Sie
did
sich immer
today,
anständig benehmen, dann wird es ja besser, nicht?
well, okay, if they always behave, then things are going to improve.
Ja,
We'll
ich habe
see.
jetzt einige Fragen. Man merkt, das ist
Yes, I have a few more questions.
auch die
It's clear that this is something which is important to our participants as well as to how to deal with these new right-wing groupings. Do you feel that your question has been answered? Or what about working group number 5? They were also looking at similar issues. So do you have any follow-up questions? Because if you do, of course, I don't want to take away the opportunity from you. Yes, you have a question.
Vielleicht können wir den Teil der Frage noch stellen,
perhaps we can ask one specific aspect, and the question is to Ms. Lasker-Harpprecht and Mrs. Lasker-Wallfisch. How would you like us as young people to behave? How should we deal with the situation we're talking about with these open racist sentiments, open anti-Semitic sentiments against the background of your experience? And the same question to you, Mr. President of the Bundestag. The question's put to both of you. How you think people should deal with racism and anti-Semitism? How should the young people deal with these things? Oh, it's difficult to say. If somebody is talking badly about the Jews, you can say, what do you have against Jews? This is something which has been happening for hundreds of years. It's not so easy. But people seem to need this in some way. They need some kind of scapegoat. They need some kind of scapegoat for everything which is not working properly. Everything's not working. It's got to be the Jews who are responsible. People used to say that it was the Jews and cyclists who were responsible for everything, were to blame for everything. That's what people used to say. There's always got to be somebody who is guilty. You should take the time to look at yourself in the mirror and see whether maybe you're guilty of something. It's kind of stupidly easy to say the Jews are guilty, they're responsible for everything. But I am surprised, I have to say, that anti-Semitism has become an issue once again, and it's a little bit depressing in a way. Okay, not everybody likes the Jews, not everybody likes the Germans. You don't have to love the whole world, but at least leave us in peace, for goodness sake. And young Israelis not daring to say that they're Israelis, oh. But in terms of the general advice I can give you, don't accept anything. If you hear things that you don't like, say something. I'm a visitor here in Germany, and I see what's happening here from an outsider's perspective. There are certain characteristics, however, that are a bit dangerous. Maybe a willingness to follow orders, perhaps crossing the road, waiting for the green light to come before you cross the road. So maybe try and change that, be a bit more rebellious.
Dazu? Gerne.
Ja, genau, dazu. Kann man nicht verstehen?
Yes, I would like to add something to that.
So jetzt?
I hope you can hear me. Just put your question briefly. Yes.
Okay.
I think you can hear me now. You said that the refugee crisis today cannot be compared with what happened in the 1930s. But often the comparison is made between political trials in those days and today. Today you spoke to the Bundestag, and there was one party represented there which I would describe as a right-wing extremist party, which was present there in the Bundestag. How does it make you feel?
welche Sorgen machen sich da breit? Oder wie,
What
wie fühlt es sich
worries
im
you
Bundestag
about
als
it? How does it feel
Holocaust-Überlebender
as a
vor
Holocaust
einer
survivor
rechtsextremen
to
Partei?
speak to the German Bundestag, the parliament, and to know that there is a right-wing extremist party represented there? Yes, so the question is how you felt speaking to the Bundestag today, because this right-wing extremist party is represented there, the AfD. And by the way, of course, they stress the fact as a party that they do not see themselves as anti-Semitic. And this is something which Mrs. Lasker-Wallfisch said in her speech. There was a unanimous resolution adopted at the Bundestag last week, including the establishment of a position of a commissioner against anti-Semitism. This is what she mentioned in her speech. Yes, it's only a piece of paper at the moment, but we'll see how it's implemented. And that was what I was talking about when I talked about the applause. As I say, let's hope that this applause was a sincere applause. But yes, but with regard to the AfD, people say that the AfD is not anti-Semitic, but are they not anti-Islamic? Is that not the same thing? Anti-Islamist, is that the same thing? No, I don't think so. I think I agree with the two ladies here. Yes, I say too, you have to be careful from the very beginning. You have to nip things in the bud. But nevertheless, anti-Semitism has a long history in our Western societies, in our Christian societies. It's terrible if you read about these things, about what happened. There was one thing we didn't know as children. There were all these restrictions. Jews were not allowed to go to certain tennis clubs, were not allowed to be members in certain clubs. So there were always these restrictions on Jews and these anti-Jewish sentiments. But then, of course, it continued with Hitler. I would like to correct you, if I may. They have the same rules in America, by the way. There are golf clubs and tennis clubs where no Jews are allowed. There is a lot of anti-Semitism in the USA on the East Coast, in parts of the USA, yes. Unfortunately. That's a different subject. But I think anti-Islamism is about angst about foreigners and angst about too many people coming to the country, but it's a different subject. And it's a very difficult thing for policymakers. And if I understood correctly what the two ladies said, they both said the same thing. Mrs. Lasker-Wallfisch said in her speech that Germany and the Federal Chancellor should be thanked for this decision which of course was not met only by applause even within the Chancellor's own party, which of course is my party too. So she was very clear in what she said, but at the same time they said too many is too many. So the state has to do two things at the same time. On the one hand, it needs to give people the feeling that there is a certain order in society. And I have always said that you can only go mad if you think too much about Auschwitz, because these were people like us, people who listened to Mozart and Schumann, or Beethoven, whatever. But then did these terrible things. So the state has to make sure that there is humanity, and the young generation has to say, we need this humanity. So that's my answer to your question. I think when you're talking to people, maybe you're meeting with friends, etc., and people say stupid things, I think people are less likely to say things about Jews these days than maybe about Muslims or about foreigners or Africans. And I can only say something when people say things like this. Don't just let people get away with what they're saying. One of you said you were from Austria, and I've heard about these this songbook, which the clubs at the Austrian universities have been using. Somebody has to have seen these songs and to realize that it's not acceptable. And you have to take action early. You have to nip it in the bud. You have to say something straight away. As soon as somebody says something like that, react. Don't wait for the demonstrations to take place. Take action, react, say something. Say something every day. These people are here in Germany now, and they are poor people. Most people, some of them may commit crimes. Perhaps we would do the same if we had to live under the same conditions. But they are people. Whatever happens, these are people who have to be helped. And humanity, of course, is inviolable. And that's why we need to make sure that humans remain human, remain humane. Yes, and please remember to turn off your microphones if you've finished your question.
Hören Sie mich? Meine
Can you hear me?
Frage, ich will erstmal meine Frage sehr kurz zusammenfassen.
I want to put my question very briefly, and my question is to Mrs. Lasker. You said that the Africans need to go back to their countries, rebuild their countries, to go back home. If that is the case, why do you not want to go back to Germany? Why do you not want to go back to Poland? If you are recommending that people should go back to their home countries, why do you not want to go back to the country in which you were born?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so you recommended that people should return to their home countries. Why do you not want to do the same thing? Why do you want to stay in the United Kingdom? Mrs. Lasker-Harpprecht lives in France and did live in Germany for quite a few years. I don't think that's the same thing. I don't think that's connected with what she said. She said it's not a solution if everybody in Africa who is experiencing a poor situation comes to Europe. Of course, we need to help those people who come to Europe because they are people, and we cannot simply let people drown in the Mediterranean. At the same time, however, and of course this applies to Africa too, at the same time, we need to make sure that we have policies which ensure that African countries are better able to create positive perspectives for the future for those young people, for the young generations there. But then there are countries like Syria where there is a war being waged at the moment, or Yemen. And then you have a different debate, I think. Then you can have a discussion about, can we help maybe to end this war? And that applies in some African countries. In some African countries there is so much corruption and so much violence being exercised by the rulers. But that's a separate issue, I think. Thankfully, we live in a Europe in which you can live wherever you want within Europe. I'm just looking at my watch and we need to finish in 7 minutes. One more question. But then I would say that's enough questions. I know that in a way the discussion's just starting. Oh, you're making a difficult situation for me. Okay, a brief question, but please put it very briefly and you can start. To end the discussion, I would like to ask you again, as contemporary witnesses, to talk about your own experiences again. Mrs. Lasker-Wallfisch, you said that you testified in the trials in Bergen-Belsen. How did that happen? What was the situation like at the time? Because, of course, you were face-to-face with the perpetrators. So perhaps we'll take an extra question and then we can have an answer to both the questions. No, I'll answer first, okay. Well, you can imagine it was a great pleasure for me. I was on the other side. The criminals were there in the courtroom, yes, but it was depressing. I was pretty naive at the time. There were really defense lawyers. Because the proof was there. It was outside the doors of the courtroom. But gradually I understood that at some point you have to stop this period where there is no rule of law. You have to reintroduce law and order, which means that everybody has the right to a fair trial. So in a way it was ridiculous to have defense lawyers, and you can read about this in my book. I was asked the most idiotic of questions. I was asked whether I'd seen that somebody had been killed by a certain person, and then they asked me on what day and at what time, and of course I was not able to answer those questions. So I had to say no, but of course they knew what had happened. And in the end they said no more questions. But gradually I understood that you did have to have some kind of break with the past, some kind of point in time where you reintroduced a system of law. Of course things went wrong, and of course not everybody got the punishment that they deserved, but I enjoyed being there. I enjoyed being on the other side. I can say that, you can imagine that, I'm sure. And then the last question. I have a question to the President of the Bundestag. You said that with regard to the refugee question, we need to make sure that the refugees are able to return to their home countries in the long term. And you said that we are doing something to help achieve this. I'd be interested to know what happens in the meetings of your parliamentary groups or other meetings that you're involved in. Do people sometimes raise the question as to what responsibility, what guilt we have with regard to the situation in the home countries, the countries that these people are coming from? Okay, so this was a question regarding people who are coming from countries, particularly coming from African countries. And they are mainly young people, and they don't see many perspectives for the future in their own countries, so they try to come to Europe. Yes, we do talk about these things. And yes, of course, if you look back over history, then you could say, I'm talking about the present day. Yes, the present day too. Yes, of course you could say that the European agricultural policy, that agricultural policies in Europe are making these problems worse rather than helping to solve them. And yes, it's good to have debates about those questions. My wife was president of the Welthungerhilfe organization for 12 years, an organization looking at food issues, and she told me that the Europeans' agricultural policies are completely wrong, and that's what you were getting at, I think. Of course there is something to this. At the same time, though, there is something else which is true here. You need economic development in the countries concerned. Modern developments take place across the world. We live in a globalized world, and people in certain parts of the world see what's happening in other parts of the world. And the mad thing is that they see what life is like in other places and they want to live like that too and don't feel happy perhaps in their lives that they have. And the same thing applies to German history, to the division of the country. People in East Germany in the 1980s perhaps did not have that terrible a lifestyle, but they saw what was happening in West Germany on their televisions, and that made them dissatisfied with the lives they led. That is just something that's the way we are as humans. So we need to give them access to modern economic development, to investments, and there are many problems involved, of course. And I was finance minister for a few years in Germany, and I can say that the highest growth rates are in African countries. And yes, we do have debates about the mistakes that we are perhaps making. And you have to be honest. We don't say America first. That's not the line we take. And maybe that's difficult, giving a message to Mr. Trump. But every elected politician has a responsibility, because every elected politician has been given a mandate by the voters. And the elected politician can talk to the voters, as many of my colleagues do, and try and persuade them of something. But by saying that things are worse in other places, that's not going to help solve the problems of the people who have elected them. I don't know whether I've answered your question. I don't know whether you're happy with my answer. There are no satisfactory answers in politics, I have to say. There is no right and wrong in politics. There are no simple truths, and that would be a piece of advice I could maybe give. With regard to the refugee issue, I think that's an excellent example of how complex policy making really is. And you have to find some way of not losing humanity, but finding some kind of solution. This is something which we can learn from history as well, I think. And that's why I always say that. Everywhere in the Western world, and that applies perhaps more in other countries than in Germany, but perhaps it applies increasingly in Germany. We have doubts in all parts of the Western world about whether the democratic institutions are still stable. That applies definitely to the UK, not to mention the USA. And I could say a great deal about other countries, of course. But one of the problems is that it's more and more difficult to get young people involved, to get them involved in democratic processes. You can't just expect the older people to give up their positions and let you in. You have to maybe also exert some pressure. You have to get involved in politics. I'm sure that you're all involved and interested in politics. That's why you've taken part in this one-week program. But get involved. It was the Weimar Republic that led to these terrible events with the Nazis. And the Weimar Republic collapsed because there were not enough Democrats. And our democracy will be strong if young people get involved. Mrs. Lasker-Harpprecht, Mrs. Lasker-Wallfisch, Mr. President of the Bundestag, that was a great end to our youth encounter, which began on Saturday and which is coming to an end today. I want to quote one sentence from Mrs. Lasker-Wallfisch. This is something which is connected with you as young people. In Brussels, after you've been liberated, you went to Brussels, And there's a sentence in your book which I think is very moving and very beautiful and provides a perspective. You said, life in Brussels began to be fun. I had lots of friends and slowly I got younger again. I think that's a really nice sentence. Thank you very much.